I'm privileged to good afternoon, May I have your attention, please? Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Priyanka Mishra, and it is my privilege to welcome you to this post-lunch session. In this session, Professor Prasenjit sir will chair the session, and we have two speakers, Professor Shamik Das Gupta and Professor Kranti Saran. Before we start this program and I introduce the speaker, I would like to call Dr. Neeti Singh to felicitate Professor Kranti Saran, sir, with memento. Give it to us, please. Ask. Go do it. Now I request Dr. Kalpana Yadav to present a memento to Professor Shamik Das Gupta. Before we begin, let me briefly introduce our speaker. First, I would introduce Professor Shamik Das Gupta. He is currently an associate professor at University of California, Berkeley, and he was former professor at Princeton University. He completed his PhD from New York University and MPhil from King's College from London. His area of specialization is metaphysics, philosophy of science, and value theory. He is an associate editor of many reputed journals, Philosopher in Print, Philosopher Review, International Studies in the Philosophy of Science, Journal of Philosophy, Mind, and so on, and lots of. And so he's also a book editor of Oxford University Press. And following him, we have Professor Kranti Saran. Kranti Saran is an associate professor of philosophy at Ashoka University. He earned his doctorate from Harvard University, Department of Philosophy in 2011, and has since been a fellow in philosophy at Harvard and a visiting fellow at the Center for Philosophy, Jawaharlal Nehru University. His research interests span the area of perception, attention, bodily awareness, introspection, mimicry, and how these topics are related to our moral relations to others. So without further ado, I now invite Professor Prasenjit Biswas, sir, to take over the proceedings. Thank you, sir. It's over to you.
Yeah, sure. So it's a very pleasant afternoon to everyone. And once again, we are going to have very salubrious philosophical discussion on notions of emptiness, as well as from Professor Sharan. Without much ado, I would request Professor Dasgupta to start his presentation, which is about philosophy of emptiness on Richard Rorty, Fine, and Nagarjuna.
Yeah, thank you. I do have a handout. Do people have a handout? It seems to have circulated. Yeah, okay. So after that delicious lunch, I suppose it's my job to try and keep you all awake for the next half an hour, which I'll try to do my best. And I'd like to actually say thank you very much. It's really a delight to be here. As you can tell by my accent, or you might be able to guess by my accent, I grew up in England. But my father actually grew up right here on the BHU campus, because my grandfather was a professor in the economics department in the 1950s. And so when I got the invitation to come and speak here at BHU, I felt tremendous honor to be able to come and speak somewhere where my grandfather worked. So thank you very much for that invitation. So yeah, the title of my presentation is going to be The Philosophy of Emptiness, Richard Rorty plus Kit Vine equals Nagarjuna. I should say something about the title before I start. I don't know anything about Nagarjuna. I was trained in analytic metaphysics, by my PhD advisor was Kit Fine. So I was taught to think about the world as a realist and think of metaphysics as uncovering the real structure of the world. And then about 8 years ago, I moved to California and got over that and started going down a kind of rabbit hole that's led me to a sort of view I think is a bit like Richard Rorty's pragmatism. It's very much the kind of opposite of the kind of thing, the realism you find in Kit Fine. But I was finding it quite difficult to know how to express my view. And I started playing around with putting little pieces of Kit Fine together with some pieces of Richard Rorty to try and express the view really clearly. And I found that I got something that looked on the face of it quite similar to what you hear about from Nagarjuna, namely that reality is empty. I don't really know anything about Nagarjuna other than that kind of catchphrase that's associated with it. So that's what I want to do today, is just to try and build a model using these tools from metaphysics that I find from people like Kit Fine and Ted Sider, plus pragmatist elements that I find from Richard Rorty, to build a model that might capture a meaning of this phrase, reality is empty. But whether it's got anything to do with Nagarjuna, I'll let you guys, you can tell me. Actually, I should qualify that. Maybe I know a little bit about Nagarjuna. I have listened to all 65 episodes of the podcast series that Professor Ganardin has made with Peter Adamson on the history of philosophy in India, which I thought was a fabulous resource. Most of them I've listened to twice, actually. Whether or not that means I know anything about the topic, I don't know. If I do, that would be great. And if I don't, you can blame Professor Ganardin. Okay, so reality is empty. What does this mean? To try and understand what it means, I'm going to take from Kit Fine the notion of reality. So Kit Fine thinks it's very important as a metaphysician to distinguish between what's the case and what's really the case, between like what's true and what's true in reality. And the intuitive idea to have in mind is just like, suppose it's all just atoms in a void. That's the sort of way you think the universe is made up. Well, still, sometimes the atoms get arranged in kind of table-like ways. And so then Kit Fine would want to say there is a table. It's just not true in reality that there's a table. It's just made up of stuff that's in reality. Okay. So that's what I'm gonna take that notion from him and write it with just, you know, he is true in reality. I'm just writing R. So reality is factive. If something's true in reality, then it's true. These are these two principles I've listed on the handout. But not in reverse. Just because something's true, it doesn't follow that it's true in reality. Just like it's true that there are tables, but it may not be true in reality that there are tables, if in fact it's all just atoms spinning in a void. You get the idea? Okay. So if we got that notion, it's kind of on the face of it quite simple to state an emptiness thesis. We just say for all P, it's not true in reality that P, right? That's a first pass behind an emptiness thesis. Now, of course, then you might want to say, well, is that true in reality? Difficult question. I think maybe at the end of the day, we might want to come back and say that is the emptiness thesis it is true in reality. And so we want to restrict the thesis to just those propositions that don't contain the concept of realism, reality itself. I'm not sure. But for the moment, let's try and go all in. And like, nothing's true in reality, like not even that. So nothing's true in reality. Still, I do have hands. Right? That's true. So all we know so far is it's not true in reality. So what kind of a truth is it? I'm just going to label it for now a conventional truth. We'll come back to start on trying to understand what conventional truth is. But let's just label it a conventional truth, which I'll write C of P. And one thing I'm going to assume about conventional truth is, again, that it's factive. So if it's a conventional truth that I have hands, then it's true that I have hands. This is not a mirage or an illusion or anything like that. In that sense, see, I've started to try, after listening to the podcast series, I've started to try and reconstruct some of the views that I've learned about in the tools of current analytic metaphysics. So I think maybe in Advaita Vedanta, you'd want something like, it's in Maya that I have hands. And maybe if it's in Maya that I have hands, it's not true that I have hands. That might be a difference between the kind of Vedantic system. and the emptiness thesis I'm building here. But I'm not sure about that. Maybe we can talk about that in Q&A. But for now, let's just assume that conventional truth is factored. Okay, now one thing I'm going to assume that's going to be quite important is that this notion of reality is kind of joint carving in a sense that you find in the work of Ted Sider. Ted Sider wrote this wonderful book in 2011 called Writing the Book of the World. And he's got this idea that a joint carving truth is a truth that conspicuously represents the world's structure. So if so here's an iPhone. If I call this thing an iPhone, that's true. I could also call it something that's either an iPhone or something, so let me introduce a word, iPhone or something that's within 5 miles of the center of BHU. Now that's a big long word. This also satisfies that word. Okay. But that word is very unjoint carving. It's a kind of gerrymandered, disjunctive, horrible thing. Okay. And Ted Sider's idea is that there's a difference between truths that things are not only true, but they carve at the joints. They're truths that are stated in vocabulary that respects the world's natural kinds, as it were. And the cash value of that is that his idea is that that connects up with accuracy and correctness. So just like truth is one respect in which a claim can be accurate, his idea is that carving at the joints is another respect in which truth might be accurate. So all else equal, a joint carving belief is more accurate than one that isn't. So if your aim is to represent the world accurately, insofar as that's what the aim of inquiry is, then on this picture we get from Ted Sider, your aim is not just to believe truths, it's to believe truths that carve at the joints. So I'm just going to assume that that goes for reality as well. The aim is not just to believe truths, but to believe things that are true in reality. You'll see this is really important for the emptiness thesis that I'm going to build. Okay, so far we've got emptiness saying that for all P, it's not true in reality that P. I just want to point out that this has elements of the realism of fine and elements of an kind of quietism of Rorty as well. Because think about what Rorty would say about all this truth and reality stuff. He'd say it's all BS, right? None of it makes sense. It's just gibberish. So if Kit Fine came into the room and said, hey, I've discovered a truth that's not just true, it's true in reality, Richard Rorty would disagree, say like, yeah, I'm not going to accept that. But he disagrees with it because he doesn't find the notion of reality intelligible in the first place. Right? Just thinks it's nonsense. Whereas the emptiness thesis I'm writing down does not think that the concept of reality is nonsense. The thesis is stated in its terms. It's an error theory about reality, not a kind of quietism about the concept of reality. That's going to be really important. Okay, so that's reality. What about convention? So far, all we know about conventional truths is that they're true, but not in reality. Okay, if P is conventional truth, then P, and it's not true in reality that P. But I don't think that can be sufficient for conventional truth, because, I mean, Kit Fine thinks that I have hands, and moreover, that that's not true in reality. It's made true by something. But that does not make him a Madhyamakan Buddhist. Okay. So there's got to be something more to conventional truth, I think. And the reason is that even though Kit Fine would not think that my having hands is true in reality, he'd think it's grounded in what's true in reality. It's like made true by what's true in reality. So in his view, it's sort of, I have hands in virtue of the fact that I have an appendage with 5 fingers. And I can sort of explain that in a metaphysical sense, kind of down the chain, and maybe end up bottoming out in physics, who knows. But at some point on his kind of view, I'm going to bottom out in some things that are true in reality. So here I think it's just going to be helpful to now help ourselves to Kit Fine's notion of ground as well. This is this kind of distinctively metaphysical way in which we can say P is the case because Q is the case. We can explain down the levels. So yeah, I'm just going to say Q grounds P. It means the same as P in virtue of Q, or P because Q in the constitutive sense of because. So fine, I think it's not true in reality that I have hands, but it is grounded in what's true in reality. And in that sense, it's part of extended reality, if you see what I mean. So we can think of extended reality as starting off with everything that's true in reality, and then including everything that's grounded in all of that. Call that extended reality, or R with the sub E on the handout. Okay. And now, of course, if emptiness is true, if nothing is true in reality, then nothing is true in extended reality either. So we can rewrite the emptiness thesis. Right? Not only is nothing true in reality, nothing's true in extended reality either. That's at the bottom of page 1 of the handout. That's what we have so far. So now we could try to characterize conventional truth like this, at the top of page 2. You could say, look, P is a conventional truth if and only if P is true, but not true in extended reality. So I think that's better. That might actually be right, but it's kind of misleading as it is. Because it suggests that conventional truth is a kind of species of truth. Right? It kind of suggests that you start off with all the truths, and then the conventional truths are the ones that aren't true in extended reality. But I think that's a very misleading way of thinking about the emptiness thesis. Because, sorry, let me get to my notes. Because I think it's a misleading way to think about the emptiness thesis, because it leaves completely mysterious where these truths come from in the first place. Right? We think it's true that I have hands, and not that I'm a tree. Okay. But why? Where does that come from? In one sense, there's not a problem here, because the emptiness thesis person can accept all the kind of claims of ground that you might want to have accepted anyway. So the emptiness thesis person can say, well, you want to know why it is that I have hands? It's because I have an appendage with 5 fingers. So in a sense, there's not a problem. The problem is really where that whole chain of grounds comes from in the first place. If you want to kind of get a glom on the problem, think about grounding non-factively for a minute. Right? So if I say that P grounds Q, that doesn't imply that P or Q is true. It just says what would explain Q if P and Q were the case. Then in the non-factive sense, I have hands because I have an appendage with 5 fingers. But equally in the non-factive sense, I'm a tree because I have a branch and leaves. So now that sort of the chains are equal, there's a symmetry between the chains. And so the question is, what makes the chain resulting in my having hands distinguished over the ones in which I'm a tree? Now, one thing we could say is it's just a brute fact. Like the truths on the left of the handout on this chain, they're just true and the others aren't, and that's all there is to say about it. But I think that's the wrong way to think about the emptiness thesis. And the reason is that according to the emptiness thesis, none of these truths on either side of the page are joint carving. As in, like, not at all joint carving. As in, like, maximally joint carving, non-joint carving. I mean, think about the truth that, like, this thing here is either an iPhone or within 5 miles of the center of BHU, right? That's pretty non-joint carving. But it's at least got some finite distance, as it were, between it and, like, reality. On the emptiness thesis, there is no finite distance between the truths on either side of this page and what's true in reality, because there is nothing that's true in reality. They're maximally non-joint carving. Now, why is that important? Because as Ted Sider very nicely noticed in his book, one feature of non-joint carving discourse is that it's not really a mistake to start talking otherwise. Here's the example that people in North America always use. It might be culturally specific. So there's the cocktail, the martini, right? You make it with kind of gin or vodka, little vermouth, slice of lemon. And you serve it in one of those martini glasses. Then it became popular in bars to make martinis with sort of this kind of sickly apple syrup flavoring thing and call it an appletini. Now, some people think, like, this is not a real martini. This is a sacrilege. And other people say, what are you talking about? This is it's a martini glass. It's a vodka-based beverage. It's, prepared in a similar way. It's a martini. Now you can imagine at a bar, you get into an argument. Like, oh, I think this is a real martini. No, it's not a martini. Okay. Who's right? Of course, it's a silly question. You're just talking about nonsense. Why? We can say what we like here because neither way of talking is any more joint carving than the other, right? We can call this thing a martini. We cannot call it a martini, and in neither case are we carving reality at its joints. It's a kind of vacuous, or as Ted Sider calls it, a non-substantive question. So now, do I have hands, or am I a tree? According to the emptiness thesis, this is a maximally non-joint carving question. It's like martinis, like appletinis, but like way more so. It's completely vacuous. It's completely silly. Or as Nagarjuna might say, it's a completely empty question. There's nothing to it. That's where suddenly the Nagarjuna-esque element of this view is starting to emerge. Excuse me, how much longer have I got?
7 minutes.
7. Okay, so it's a little bit tricky how to put what I just said. But I'm going to skip over the techie details because I've only got 7 minutes. So the key point right now is that if you take the emptiness thesis, which remember doesn't reject the notion of joint carving, it's an error theorist about joint carving. So it accepts that there's this degree, respect of accuracy whereby you're doing better when you're carving the world at the joints. It agrees with that. It just thinks there are no such joints. Once we've got that in play, it starts to look like every question is just as empty as the Appletini question, except much more so. So now go right to the end of the handout, the philosophy of emptiness. I start out thinking that I'm not a tree. Okay, that's what I am not a tree. Then I have a revelation. I discover the reality is empty. Maybe I go on meditation or I drop LSD or something, and I discover reality is empty. So I discover actually that it's actually just a conventional truth that I'm not a tree. Okay, that's number 2. Now this doesn't negate one yet, because remember, conventional truth is factive. So it's fine, I'm still not a tree. But it does mean that the question of whether I'm a tree is completely empty. It's just like Appletinis, except more so. It's no mistake to think that I am a tree. It's no mistake to think that I'm not a tree. The very question of whether I'm a tree is completely confused insofar as it presupposes that there's an answer. There is no answer. We may as well say, I am the tree, I am not the tree, I am neither tree nor not tree. Like it makes no difference on this emptiness thesis. All empty questions. To my untrained ear, that starts to sound like the kind of version of Nagarjuna that I've been presented with. But my question for you, I suppose, is whether that's true. I'll finish that. Do we do Q&A now? No, okay. Okay.
I think even more time, right? Because there are only 2 speakers. The third speaker. Yeah, but I shouldn't think of it. Let's have a discussion and then we can follow it up on. So, I don't know, one second. What comes out of it, probably, though, I mean, it's open to your consideration, is that there is a hard-hitting, factive truth, which is real, which is available before us, and we need to pursue it, hot pursuit of truth in a certain way. Once again, back to truth. Okay, so without standing between the speaker, Professor Dasgupta and you, the house is open, and Srikola, yeah, please.
And to that, I'm a little suspicious whether I. Conventionalism and art, are you proposing that they are, hierarchical? See,
the emptiness, shunya, and the conventional, they are not placed in the same level. First, and you were also asking, where is this truth coming from? That is, why is it that I have hands is true, while why is it false that I'm a tree? The conventional truth again comes from causal efficacy. In Shunya is that which is beyond causation, beyond space-time, limitation. I did not understand the full notation of what you have said. So are they implicated in this? That is all.
Yeah, so good. On the model that I presented, so you said, where does conventional truth come from? I think the thing, this is actually, I didn't quite get to this because I was skipping over to keep the time. But I think once you go through the empty question stuff and you see, well, you know, if I ask, am I a tree or do I have hands? And you take on board that it's completely not, it's maximally a non-joint carving question. So you can say what you want. So then I think that the inevitable thing that follows then is that conventional truth is really whatever we take it to be. This is where you kind of, it starts to sound very Richard Rorty. If there's an agreement that I have hands, I have hands. If there's a general agreement that I'm a tree, then I'm a tree. But, you know, in the same way that Richard Rorty starts saying that truth is social agreement and so on, you get kind of that kind of picture. This is what makes it, I mean, so as a personal note, I'm more interested in just trying to make sense of the model than as to actually what, to the extent to which it resembles Nagarjuna. Because in independent work, I've been developing a kind of theory of truth that's quite Rortian. It's very hard to know how to kind of put it and define it. So I'm starting to fiddle around with this kind of model to see if there's a way of actually capturing the things that I was saying in this other work. And I was saying things like, truth is nothing over and above truth by our lights. What does that mean? Well, I think it's sort of what you get here. That's what conventional truth, I think, is. But the element that you're talking about, it sounds like that's not coming out in the model. That's right.
Any other question, comments? Yeah.
Thank you, sir, for this wonderful presentation. Like your way of presenting got me very engaged with your discussion. Throughout the discussion, I was really engaged with what you were saying. Uh, you talked a lot about the state of indeterminacy, like emptiness, like we can call something that it is, we can call it is not, like it's just conventional. So I just want to ask you that Nagarjuna has also mentioned about the emptiness of emptiness. So like, what's your interpretation on that? Like, what you will say on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that's coming to whether this question is to whether the emptiness thesis itself is true in reality, I think, right? And, or more specifically, if you just take a particular proposition, the emptiness thesis implies that it is not true in reality. Is that true in reality? I'm not sure which way to go there. I can see that, yeah, to go fully all in, you have to say that even that's not true in reality. And that's the kind of model that I was putting on the table during the talk. I'm a little nervous as to whether that's a stable point, though. Because if that's not, if the emptiness thesis isn't true in reality either, then we can say what we want. Right? I mean, we can say the emptiness thesis. It's not like that's ruled out, but it's like there'd be no mistake going the other way. And so if you wanted the thesis itself to be a more robust thesis, you might want to think that it itself is itself true in reality. Now, so that's like now we could call it a weak emptiness thesis. So what do we get from there? We do now get that there are some truths in reality, but they're all negative truths. They're all truths of the form, that's not real, that's not real, that's not real, that's not real. So we still get that if we're asking about whether I have hands or whether I'm a tree, that's still maximally non-joint carving. It doesn't have any basis in anything real. Do you see what I mean? So I think I can still get the emptiness of questions as to whether I have hands or whether I'm a tree, even if I go in just for that weak emptiness thesis. It does sound in that respect, though, in that it would be different from, yeah, the full-blooded thing that you might that you get in Nagarjuna. And I haven't thought about this long enough to figure out which exact way I want to go.
Yeah, thank you, Sam, for your really interesting presentation. Uh, I have not read Nagarjuna at all, but I'm just trying to think afresh about this emptiness thesis. That when Nagarjuna is presenting the idea of emptiness, is it that he is suggesting the elimination of metaphysical reality, that this metaphysical reality is completely unavailable to our cognitive apparatus? And then this metaphysical reality is unavailable to our cognitive apparatus. Right. And in that way, the reality becomes conventional, or it goes very similar with what Rorty would suggest, that there is no metaphysical reality. Reality depends upon what you say, the social solidarity, or the epistemology, sociologized, right? So what peoples would ultimately agree on, like the example that you have been giving, whether I am a hand or I'm a tree, right? Of course, it will eventually turn out to be what other peoples would say. So, I mean, it is not becoming a kind of solipsistic state that you are not individually concluding that whether you are a hand or a tree, but everyone else has to agree, right? And beyond that, there is no such possibility to map the reality in a metaphysical sense, because that correspondence theory is really, I mean, it rests on a very shaky grounds. So how would you like to respond?
Yeah, it's really, I mean, and I mean, it's one thing having Nagarjuna on the table. It's another thing having Rorty interpretation on the table. But there's a way of reading a fictional Rorty, a kind of a picture of Rorty that you can get from his writings, where it looks very different from what you get from this emptiness thesis. Because you ask him, you know, Richard Rorty, like, do I have hands or am I a tree? He won't think that's an empty question. He'll think that's a perfectly straightforward question. And the answer is that I have hands. He's a serious thinker. I mean, it's not. And the reason why is that he's not an error theorist about reality. He's a quietist. He just doesn't think there's any distinction between truth and real truth. And so because there's no distinction between truth and real truth, the question as to whether I have hands is just a question of whether I have hands. It's only when you take seriously enough metaphysics to think there could be a distinction, and then add the error theory to say, actually, that the question becomes completely empty. So I'm not sure, so going back to your question, if you really just take Rorty as being a kind of quietist person who rejects the very notion of reality altogether, I don't think you get the conclusion that all questions are empty in the sense that I get in this paper. Now, he often talks as if they are, but I wonder whether he's earned the right to actually say that. I'm not sure. And then we're into Rortian interpretation. That's for another conference, probably.
Yeah, thanks for a really wonderful paper. So actually what you just said about quietism just really clarified things for me. But I want so it actually turned my question from what might have been an objection friendlier, which is that so if you think that all discourse is maximally non-joint carving, right? And you think that the only truths are, as it were, about reality are really negative truths, right? Then you know, and you know, there's this position in Indian philosophy, good neti neti, where really the only thing you can say is not this, not that, not that, and then it looks like you should just keep quiet, right? One should just be silent, right? And then of course this wonderful, you know, in the suttas where the Buddha just sort of is silent, and that's supposed to be like the deepest. So in a way, like I think if I understand your view correctly, you have a reading that links all these things together in a very nice and interesting kind of way.
Yeah, I think a lot hangs on this, back to this question as to whether you say that the emptiness thesis itself is true in reality. If you do, then you get the netty stuff, right? If you want to say how reality is, like not this, not that, not that. If you don't, and you want to say how reality is, then you're stuck.
Yeah.
Like there's literally nothing you can say. All you've got is a situation where every sentence, every question is maximally silly. So what might you do to express that? Well, you might start asking obviously silly questions. Like we're into kind of Zen koan kind of. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think that it really hangs on whether you stick an R in front of the emptiness. Yeah.
Just a second. I mean, I'll go to, but I'm a Rothian because I did my PhD on Roti. So I have a word for Roti here. The way you are saying that, Roti is always going for a non-metaphysical truth. But Roti is also explaining the physical truth as, a kind of an embodied physical state of the world, which is embodied physically. So it's there, in a relationality or in touch, So there is this point of touching, which is not necessarily curving, but a point of touching. So the point of touching is very much necessary to understand the collective intentionality as we do it in social epistemology, that there is a joint touching of the truth, jointly seeing the truth. There's a joint touching, whether it is curving or not curving is another matter. Raising a substantivist metaphysical question after jointly touching or not touching is also another matter. It's a post facto question. So therefore, Roti has this primordial notion of physical truth as physical reality, being an audience.
Yeah, you see, he says stuff like that, but I think we have to keep him honest. I think we either take that notion of touching seriously or we don't. If we take it seriously, right? Well, if we don't take it seriously, yeah. I'm tempted to think that we just got to try and keep him on it. Are you using this notion of touching or physical reality seriously or not? If it's seriously, you're just doing a kind of Kit Fine, Ted Sider metaphysics in disguise, and you're pretending not to. If not, then I think you've got this quietism that you. Now I know he sometimes tries to speak out of both sides of his mouth, but I just think I'm trying to keep him honest.
But anyway, Roti is very serious about this. So in Bermuda's sense,
Yeah.
the sense of touching, the sense that touches.
Let me put it like this. Touching cannot be a metaphysical notion. It might be a relation embedded in a physical science, a biological science, a social science, a science then that is kind of open for revision given new empirical data. It can't be anything like correspondence with reality in this kind of metaphysical sense, because the whole pragmatism, his whole thing, is premised on giving up any notion of mirroring, copying, representing. So now that I'll put it again, either the notion of touching is this metaphysical correspondence thing or not. If it's the correspondence thing, he's fine inside or in disguise. And if it's not, I think we're just in quietism, now using a notion of touching that we borrowed from the. Okay. Then I'm just classifying that as quietism, because it's just he's looked at the empirical sciences and they tell us that certain neurons fire when I'm presented with yellow or whatever, and and that's just the kind of empirical scientific truth, which is just true by convention.
Or any other. Anyone. Sure, please.
Okay.
Have you to some kind of a
Yeah, so this is not the reference to physical sciences or empirical sciences. Even in our country, touching has some social, that is also social is also relational, but actually touching goes beyond social and empirical. It is also phenomenological. I mean, you don't have to go to uh, what is it? John Merleau-Ponty. You can ask anyone, particularly from the upper caste, what is the sense of touching? Now you can define touching without touching. Yeah. So I think we have been,
I see.
touch has been a very touchy.
Yeah, good. Very good.
So I think we should also give some due respect, epistemic respect to the word called touching. And that's the plea. Yeah.
If, again, it's fine. Clear, I mean, given the meaning in literal English, the notion is very important in social respects, as you point out. What it isn't, though, in ordinary English, is a metaphysical notion that has anything to do with correspondence or copying. And so I'm just going back to the same thing I said before. If we keep that front and center, then and we hold the Rorty honest to this idea that whatever is going on here is not copying and correspondence, then it's just a quietist position where he's borrowing from truths he's finding in the sciences or phenomenology about, right? And so those truths, where are those truths coming from? From agreement, from social agreement. It's all that's going on. And as soon as he says anything more than that, like, oh, it's actually some kind of correspondence, bang, he's back into realist metaphysics.
Just a second.
Ah, that's, yeah. Good. Yes. Yeah. That's the sort of position, actually, I'm calling the one where you're borrowing a notion of copying from just the empirical sciences or something, because the sciences will describe the way in which a tree interacts with its environment and has causal, counterfactual, tracking kind of relations to its environment. And so, of course, then we can, as scientists, describe that. Yes, absolutely.
If I followed you correctly, I might have followed you in different way. But if emptiness is empty, but it does not mean that it is not giving emergence to any kind of sense. It is not the affirmation of negation, it is only the negation of affirmation. In that case, in this sense, there is emergence of sense. Only the attempt is that there should not be essentiation of anything.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
So, instead of negation, but negation of affirmation giving birth to different kind of important sense in life. When saying that it comes from narrative.
Yeah.
So narrative is also
Good.
Thing is that you should not stick to that sense. Sense is always in its momentary flux. But that sense is even empty because each moment it is different.
Good. Yeah.
It is people always try to demolish this. Everything is empty is also empty, but there is also sense. So that's what I wanted to say. And Rorty was saying that it is not metaphysically present, but in that sense, in that way, in the approach, there is sense. That's what you wanted to say. But if you present in that way, I would like to say that it won't be justice to the reading, to the work
Yeah.
of Rorty.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm not sure if I'm hearing you properly, quite literally and figuratively, but One thing I'm hearing from you is that you were talking about sense making. I was hearing, and that in sense making, it's very important to put narrative down. I think that's consistent with the model that I was laying down, and where that would show up is in this. So I'm understanding P is conventionally true. That means something like Biarlites P. And what does Biarlites P? Biarlites might include, like, what do we take to be true? It might be that we are the kind of creatures who take things to be true only when they fit a certain kind of narrative, and therefore only when they give a certain amount of meaning. That's to say, our practices of accepting, rejecting different propositions. The idea is we include a practice of laying down narrative. And that would be very important for us because it's narrative that gives us meaning. So if that's what you were saying, I think that's all compatible with the kind of model that I was laying down, although I didn't say it in the talk. But that's the sort of the way that I'm thinking. That's the way that I'm thinking about truth is nothing over and above truth by our lights in this other work that I've been trying to get done for the last few years. But yeah, that didn't come out in the talk today. But I may have misheard you. Was that sort of what you had in mind?
Shunyata. In fact, as far as I understand, Nagarjuna talked about Shunya. Things are Niswabhava and therefore Shunya. He did not say that there is something called Shunyata about which we can ask a question, whether it is Shunya or not.
Good.
So this question itself will be a wrong question. It will be crossing the category. That is, it will be of a different category.
Yeah.
Because when everything is Shunya, language stops. Inexpressibility, it is a state of inexpressibility.
Yeah.
And you cannot ask further whether inexpressibility itself is expressible or not.
Yeah.
Secondly, I feel that
can I say something to that before?
maybe yes.
And then you can go. Just since it's live in the room, I think you're absolutely right. And so if you translate it into the language of this model, I think what you're saying is that Nagarjuna wouldn't even understand as intelligible the notion of reality. If that's the view, I find it difficult why you then get this conclusion that everything's empty, that all questions are empty. The only way I could kind of see how to reconstruct it is if you do take it seriously but become an error theorist about it. Now then you can sort of say what you wanted to say, because if you ask them, like, is anything out there real? Say no. It's like, as it were, the concept is intelligible. There's nothing out there to which it corresponds.
Now, secondly, as far as I understand, Nagarjuna's establishment of his Shunyata is based on criticism of Samvriti. And criticism of Samvriti in all its aspects. Not, I mean, here the example that you are giving, that I have a hand, suppose you say that means appendage of 5 fingers. Now, Nagarjuna would question that also.
Good.
Otherwise, you may say that this is, one may say, a realist could say that this is just an analysis. So both the statements are true. What is, why do you want to transcend a particular statement, or not only particular but all statements, and go beyond that?
That's a great point. I hadn't seen that actually. But that's true. I think the way that's coming out in the model here is that even statements of ground are going to end up being empty questions. I think that's going to actually follow on this model as well. So that's very helpful for you to point out. Thank you.
I think Shamik herewith, because we will go to the next presentation. Thank you very much for generating so much of discussion, and a big hand for him. Okay. You can go up to 30 minutes. Is that enough? Yeah, that's and then you can leave time for discussion. I'm sure a lot of discussion. Yeah. Normally, an introduction is to be given to Professor Sharan. Have we introduced him? Or I introduce him in whichever way I like it. Okay, let me take this chance of introducing Professor Sharan. Professor Sharan is a well-known philosopher from India, in North Indian philosophy, who teaches, I mean, he is an Indian philosopher, but not Indian philosopher in a quotable sense. I'm distorting him as an Indian philosopher. He is a philosopher from India. So kind of deflationary statement. He has a PhD from Harvard University in the area of philosophy of money. And probably his work was related to penetration of the belief states to other cognitive agents. Probably that's it. And since then, he came back to India and taught in Ashoka University. Right now, he teaches in Ashoka University. Very, very interesting, enthralling works on philosophy of mind that has participated. I think that will be.
Yeah, that's very generous. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak. This is the first time I've ever been to BHU, and it's really lovely to be at such a legendary place. So far, I just want to thank the organizers. Thank you, Rahul, for inviting me, and for everybody for being here. Just very quickly, the papers that we have all seen so far are large canvases that extend, that paint broad pictures over a fairly large area terrain. And I think Professor Dasgupta's paper was again very sort of encompassing in that way. And if you think of those as big landscapes, what I'm going to present is more like a Mughal miniature, and not even, and then that too, it's more like one bit of a Mughal miniature. So the topic is attention. I mean, the title, my original title was Attention Without the Will, rethinking the distinction between the top down and bottom up attention. But as I started working on it, really what you're going to see today is just a defense of one premise in a much longer argument that will actually speak to issues of the will. So I actually would say very little about the will. So you just have to remember that if you were wondering what is the connection between this paper and Buddhism and pragmatism, unfortunately it does connect up, but much later on, and unfortunately I'm not going to be able to present that today. So without any further ado, let me just sort of start talking about what's going to happen. If you want to follow along as to where we are in the talk, just look at the right-hand bar, and that will give you an idea of where exactly we are in the talk. So I want to just introduce the idea of a top-down effect of attention in perception. And you'll notice that in the first image, right, it's the T, which is the only blue T, kind of pops out at you, right? So that's called attentional pop-out. But if you were to look on the right-hand side, you'll see that there's one thing that is odd. There's one figure that is unlike the others, but it doesn't pop out in the way that the T does over here with a different color. In fact, you can see, if you pay attention, that you have to look for it. There's a brown X, right? Does everybody see the brown X? Can I see some hands if you see the brown X, right? But you have to look for it. It doesn't pop out at you in the way that the blue T does. Let's just look at another example. Look at the following kind of sentence. A furry black cat walked through the door. Now, did anybody have any difficulty whatsoever reading this sentence? No, wrong answer. You didn't have any difficulty, right? You all were able to read it. But notice that the orthographic shape of the H in cat is identical to the orthographic shape of the H in THE. But because we have top-down semantic information about what would be the appropriate letter to be, we have no issue in processing the sentence and just reading it flawlessly as the black cat walked through the door. We're not confused to say, oh my gosh, now this This looks like just like the same letter. This other word, what could it possibly be? No, we're just on the fly, immediately able to disambiguate it, right? And now I'm going to show you this picture, and I'm going to tell you there are two very different ways of seeing this image, right? How many of you see a brick wall, right? That's the easy way of seeing it, right? Everybody see the brick wall? Yes? Okay. Now, I'm going to tell you that there's something sticking out of this brick wall. And put your hand up when you see it. Don't say what it is. Just put your hand up when you see it. Huh? Okay, I see quite a few hands going on. Okay, so let's hear from you. What do you see? A paper. Where? Where? Here? Okay. Stone. A stone. This thing looks like a stone. Okay. Well, in the interest of time, because I don't have very much time, I'm going to tell you that in fact, if you look a little more, in fact, if we could cut the top, if we could cut the tube lights, it might be helpful. If you look at this image a little more carefully, right? Just if you can cut these lights, so that's okay. So here's there's actually a cigar sticking out of the wall. Can you see the cigar sticking out of the wall? This is actually the bit of ash of the cigar. Oops, no, what happened? Make this go back. Okay. Okay. Who can see the cigar sticking out of the wall now? Right? Yeah. Do you see that? Okay. I'm only seeing a few hands. Okay. How many of you see the cigar? Right? You see the cigar? Right? There's the cigar. Yeah, right. Now you see it's sticking out in this three-dimensional way. Everybody see the cigar? This is the cigar sticking out of the wall like that, right? Now that was something that was staring at you in the. How many of you see the cigar now? Right? Okay, now you see the cigar, right? Okay, but the point is now at first you were not able to see the cigar, right? Then when I prompted you and gave you a kind of a cue that look for a cigar and here's where to look, then you were able to see, oh, okay, this is a cigar. So that's a top-down kind of effect, right? Again, that's a kind of top-down effect. Now, why is it that we care about top-down effects? Well, philosophers care about them because in particular, I mean, so for example, in the philosophy of mind, philosophers are very interested to know things like, well, are perception and cognition distinct psychological kinds, distinct natural psychological kinds, right? Just in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the quote. And in moral philosophy, we also want to know how does what we choose to focus on in people and how they appear to us affect how we treat them, right? So there's a very famous, the standard example that's trotted out here is this passage from Iris Murdoch, where this very sort of aggressive mother-in-law who thinks very little of her daughter-in-law. She thinks that, oh, she's flighty and silly and just not a creature of great substance. When she pays attention to different aspects of the daughter-in-law, she realizes that no, this woman is actually just youthful and fun and a source of joy and happiness. And so the way she treats her changes her, right? So how things, what we're attending to, what we choose to attend to, also makes a huge moral difference to our lives, right? Because it can change how we treat people, what aspects we choose to focus on. Okay, cognitive scientists also care about the top-down distinction because if you look at the image, I think you might see this more clearly if you look at the screen projection on the right-hand side. If you look at it, this is the same image, right? Oh, there's no tricks going on here. But if you focus on what the image looks like when you're focusing on the vertical stripes, it looks very different from how it looks when you focus on the horizontal stripes, right? And why vision scientists are interested in this, because what's, again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to stop too long on this Carrasco quote, but the point is that you have exactly the same light hitting the retina in both cases, right? But there's a shift in the attentional stance of the person such that what the phenomenological experience is very different in both cases, right? And so we want to know, how does that come about, right? How is it that the shift of attention can completely change what that image looks like, just as a shift of attention completely changed what that image looked like, right? Okay, so both scientists and philosophers are interested in the top-down distinction, but the problem is that people, and in particular today, I'm going to be focusing on the scientific dispute. They disagree about how we should use the terminology of top and down, right? How we should think of top-down effects and bottom-up and the bottom-up. And that's important. It's not just a mere verbal dispute, because you need to have a kind of standardized terminology if scientists are not to completely talk past each other, and if there's not to be just a kind of terminological confusion, right? And people talking past each other and thinking they're disagreeing, but actually meaning completely different things by the same terms that they're using. We want to be able to agree on what our terms mean, right? So scientists are interested in, like, let's try and figure out how we should think about the top-down distinction. Okay, so the traditional way of thinking about what the top-down distinction is in terms of bottom-up influences and a top-down influence, right? So the bottom-up influence is just, the PU means bottom-up, in influence on the nervous system due to extrinsic properties of the stimuli. So the idea is that it's just like the properties of the stimuli, whereas something like a top-down influence is influence on the nervous system due to extra retinal effects, such as intrinsic expectations, knowledge, and goals, right? So just for example, when you look at the image of the cigar sticking out, then once you had a piece of knowledge, right, then that changed how it looked. That was a kind of top-down influence. And notice immediately that when people draw the top-down distinction in this way, they make a distinction between so-called mandatory top-down processes, that is, attentional processes that influence sensory processing in an automatic and persistent manner, from voluntary top-down processes, that is, attentional processes that exert influence on sensory processes through an act of volition, such as willfully shifting attention to the right part of space, right? All of us, to a certain degree, can control our attention. I can just swivel my head and decide to attend to what's over there, right? So there's some degree of control that we have over our attentional capacities, right? Of course, when people talk about top-down influences, they don't mean something like turning your head. They mean something that is more an internal psychological process, right? Relevant to what it looks like perception. So this distinction, the traditional dichotomy, this was just like two things, right? Bottom-up influence and a top-down influence, that was already challenged very early in what was called the cocktail party effect, right? How many of you have heard of the cocktail party effect? It's basically when someone says your name, you're having a conversation with someone, but then you hear your name being called by someone, right? I mean, they're talking about you. They're not talking to you, they're just talking about, but you hear your name and immediately your attention is drawn there, right? So, in the cocktail party effect, the given name of a person was found to break through the attended stream in a dichotic listening task. So in a dichotic listening task, that a person is wearing headphones and they're getting two different streams of information, right? In one, they're supposed to attend to what's happening over here and ignore whatever is happening over here, right? And they have to repeat whatever they hear in this year and ignore what happens in this year. And what happens is most of the time they have no recollection of what happened in this year. But then if they hear their name, then that breaks through. Participants were not tasked with listening for their name, the volume of which was no greater than other sounds played to the unattended ear that showed no such breakthrough effect, making it difficult to argue that this breakthrough was either goal-related or stimulus-driven. And it just became a noted exception, but to the general top-down, bottom-up view, but it didn't fit in with that, right? And eventually, to accommodate this kind of case and also some other empirical evidence that started to accumulate, a trichotomy was proposed. According to the trichotomy, what you have is not just a bottom-up and a top-down series of influences, but you also have what's known as selection history. Selection history is a distinct source of influence on the attentional priority map that is formed, that is the map of things, of the space around you, that shows up as, where it is that you're going to be placing your attention. And the idea here is that the underlying notion is that attention is often deployed in a way that is neither consistent with the top-down goals of the observer, nor is it driven by salient stimuli impinging on the retina. That's just the standard top-down distinction, right? In addition to top-down and bottom-up control, these lingering biases are due to selection history, affect the integrated priority map. And there's a lot that can be said about how to think about selection history. But the point I want to get across to you is that we have good reasons, good empirical reasons to move from a dichotomy to a trichotomy, right? Now, that was then objected to, again, by some other psychologists who said, no, this selection history is not some distinct thing. It's just a different kind of top-down influence, right? And unfortunately, one of the people who proposed the selection history insisted that whatever's top-down should be, the top-down part should just be thought of as identified with what is voluntary. And this objection and this example, which we've already seen, is a good counterexample to that, right? Because it is a top-down effect of your semantic knowledge that you're able to read that the first is cat and the second occurrence as the, right? But it's an automatic process. It's not like you have to make some kind of voluntary decision. And so there is some justification in these psychologists complaining that no, saying that there's some third category is just going to confuse everybody, right? But then a fourth proposal came on the table by the psychologist Benoni that said, look, in fact, it's all just on a spectrum. We can't actually divide up these things into just 2 influences or 3 influences. They are all on a spectrum. And she says, all instances of attentional guidance can be classified on a 2-dimensional spectrum space produced by 2 independent variables. A volition scale from voluntary attentional allocation guided by explicit relevance to involuntary attentional allocation guided by implicit relevance. And B, a temporality scale from temporary and specific relevance to permanent and general relevance, right? And she claims that these 2 dimensions kind of capture all the aspects of the factors guiding attentional selection that we care about, but they lie on a spectrum, right? So and so just to summarize all the different proposals that we have, right? There's the first view, which is a dichotomy. There's bottom up, top down. Then there's the trichotomy. So where you have, selection history in the middle. And then there's the response to the trichotomy that says, no, this is actually just a different kind of top-down effect. And then you have really the giving up of the idea that there's any kind of pure input stimuli, right? Everything is permeated right down to the bottom with potential influences from the cognitive system, right? Now, so in fact, Benoni goes on to say that having herself proposed a spectrum view, she goes on to say that, well, we should consider a simple and immediate solution, giving up the use of the concepts top down and bottom up in the study of attentional guidance. So, but her argument for saying this is not a very good argument, right? Because what she's saying is, this assertion may imply that reaching a consensus in the definition seems improbable. Therefore, in the meantime, we should consider a simple and immediate solution. Can we make this go away, this thing? Anyway, whatever. But this is not a good argument. Why is it not a good argument? Because it's going from a premise about the lack of consensus not being strong enough to thinking that that's just a reason to reject something. And, you know, that's not a good argument, right? The principle that the moment we should reject something the moment people disagree about it is not, you know, some people can just be wrong, right? So we need more principled grounds if we had to reject the top-down distinction. And that's what I'm going to try and provide to you in the last 10 minutes of my talk. I'm going to actually look at 6 different reasons for the conclusion that we should give up the idea of the top-down distinction. 3 of them are kind of more empirical reasons from Burge, and 3 of them, well, I should actually just stop speaking, and we have the man himself here, Professor Ganeri, whose work I will be referring to. All right. So the first is Tyler Burge's objection that it's a misnomer. For anybody working on the philosophy of mind, if you're interested in the philosophy of mind, please read Tyler Burge's book. It's a massive, really painful to go through book. It's 730 pages, but it's really, really useful, and it will change the way you think about a lot of issues. Okay, so Burge says, scientific accounts of visual processing in the last few decades have changed. They highlight recurrent and horizontal processing as complementary to feed-forward processing. Feed-forward processing begins with retinal stimulation. Registration of the retinal image undergoes processing already in the eye itself. The signal passes out of the eye through many stages, associated, for example, with the LGN, V1, MT, V5, V2, V3, V4, IT, and beyond. Current science recognizes multi-directional processing in perception formation. And he goes on to say, little of the feedback comes from any well-delineated top of a processing hierarchy. Often, top-down applies in a more restricted way to feedback from frontal and parietal areas. These are large, multifunctional areas of the brain. They do not define a clear top and do not even mark a type of processing function in feedback. The point that I want, just in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the rest of what he says here. But the big picture is that, look, the very label that we use of top down, bottom up is misleading. There is no top. There is no interesting. There's no interesting sense of top. There's no interesting sense of bottom here in the first place. The second is that it has the pernicious effect of blurring conceptual and perceptual levels, right? And Burge cautions against inferences from broadly defined brain areas to type or level of representational function. So, for example, the following inferences are unsafe because they often blur perceptual and conceptual levels, right? The perceptual is different from the conceptual level, and we get into muddles if we somehow just squish them together. So, for example, you'll hear scientists say things like, any feedback comes from the prefrontal cortex, it is cognitive. Or if any feedback comes from the orbital frontal cortex and the hippocampus, it is cognitive. Anything that's just a mistake, right? That's just to confuse 2 different levels. And I have the page references up here. If you're interested in these issues, please do go and check it out for greater detail. Finally, Burge's third objection is that it is a mistake to identify all top-down influences with cognitive influences. And he has a lot to say about that, but just for the purposes of summarizing what he has to say is that the basic problem with the proposal lies in the inference that drives the enterprise, taking perception and cognition to be exhaustive aspects of the mind. One cannot infer that a representational state is cognitive from it not being a perceptual state, right? Because there just are other kinds of states. There are states that in fact, part of the whole project of the book is to identify intermediate level states that are not perceptual states, but not fully fledged cognitive states either. And those actually form a kind of bridge between the two. And he does that in a quite extraordinarily detailed and quite plausible way. Okay, now we get to Professor Ganeri's objections. The first objection is that the whole idea of a top-down distinction assumes a very philosophically loaded conception of the subject, right? So he says it is evident, however, that these formulations are philosophically loaded, implying commitment to notions of voluntary will. So in particular, in this passage, he's talking about a top-down influence, in particular what we saw in the first instance as a voluntary top-down influence, right? So that appeals to the notion of a voluntary will, deliberate intent on the part of the perceiver, control of the observer. In other words, to an authorship model of self-control in which it is and now he's quoting a prominent philosopher of attention, Wayne Wu, it is a psychological subject who exhibits top-down, endogenous, goal-directed, controlled or voluntary attention, right? But again, this is a very particular conception of what it means to be a subject, right? And in the larger paper, of which all this material is one very, very small part, I trace out the development of the idea of the will through time, and how people have thought about the will in very different ways, and in particular in terms of what you might think of nowadays as the dynamics of volition. There's a very nice and helpful book by Nalini Devdas called The Dynamics of Volition in Theravada Buddhism, which I would urge you to look at. His second objection is that it encodes a controversial conception of human action. The purported distinction between endogenous and exogenous, which cognitive psychologists help themselves to, brings with it far too many theoretical presuppositions to be helpful in the analysis of attention. Most particularly, it takes for granted an orthodox view in the philosophy of action that philosophers have begun to question, that the causal theory of action provides an adequate foundations for a theory of mental action, right? And the causal theory says, well, look, you have an idea, and that is then sets off, that kicks off a kind of causal chain such that you decide, okay, now I made this mental decision to raise my arm, and that results finally in my raising my arm, right? But again, this conception of action is one that many people have some very, very good objections to, and is increasingly hard to sustain. And we can do better than that, right? So what is the account of attention that is going to look like once we have a much better account of action? And finally, he claims that it's going to result in an unacceptable dualism. If one defines an exogenous process to be one that is unaffected by the performance of another process, or as not under voluntary control, how can we begin to even formulate the issue of interaction? The endogenous-exogenous distinction brings a dualism to the philosophy of attention that no solution to the mind-body problem can resolve, right? So just like you have a dualism between the mind and body, Professor Ganeri is here warning us against a dualism between endogenous and voluntary and non-voluntary influences and how we could reconcile them. The very terms endogenous and exogenous imply a contrast between what is internal and external in origin, and encode an inappropriately Cartesian metaphor about mind, right? As some sort of Cartesian theater where all of these are coming to some internal observer who's sitting and, is the final recipient of the products of mental activity. So I have one slide left and 1 minute left. So just to summarize what have I done in this talk? I've tried to explain the top-down distinction. I've tried to motivate for you why we should care about the top-down distinction. And then I've tried to explain to you a kind of psychological dispute about the top-down distinction, which ends with one position saying we should just get rid of this distinction. But then the argument that Benoni gives for getting rid of the distinction is not a very strong one. And so I've tried to look at what some philosophers have written to try and marshal together the reasons, which for those of you who are familiar with an argument map, this is just like, this is the conclusion that you want, and then these are the different reasons. It's like what it sits on, right? And so these 6 reasons all individually give some support to the conclusion that we have good reasons not to model the mechanisms and itemize the factors of attentional control in terms of a cognitive top and a stimulus-driven bottom. Okay. Thank you. I'm done. Yeah.
I think Professor Karan giving us a very alluring talk with a bit of cognitive experiments before us, and many of us have taken part in those desired experiments. And in that sense, his talk has made a huge cognitive penetration. This project was very successful. Now, any question, comment, Professor Karan's comments are most welcome. Or predictions that were cited, and any other, yeah.
So I wanted to know what is the philosophical ramification of your talk. Now trying to support naive realism. Your talk was against naive realism, or was it in anti-realism? So how do you situate yourself in this debate between realism and anti-realism?
I'm happy to tell you my incipient views on that issue, but in terms of whether anything I said here speaks directly to that, I think it would be hard to draw any firm conclusions from anything I presented today, right? But I do think that I think my intuitions are, I have a more kind of realist disposition than Professor Dasgupta, who I think is more friendly to a kind of anti-realist view. I think emptiness. Yeah. Well, but then there are all these sort of ways to think about what's the best way of thinking about emptiness. I mean, in my own view, I have been very interested in naive realism and trying to see if we can get some kind of version of naive realism to work. But as of now, I think that a lot of the objections that are made against naive realism are not very good objections, and that they can all be circumvented. But I'm not yet convinced by naive realism. But I don't think this talk really spoke to that. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Kranti, for your really engaging presentation. I was just wondering that this Benoni's position that you really referred, that where he's saying that sorry, yeah, C. So where he says that there's no such recognition or perception which is without any selection or
no. She's not. No, that's not what she claims. She's just saying that she's talking about a distinction. She's not making a claim about any one particular perception. She's saying, let's ditch the distinction and in terms and map the space of possibilities in terms of this two-dimensional spectrum. She's not making any specific claim that, this particular thing is that clear?
Okay, I'm just trying to relate it with what Davidson and Seller has to say about the myth of the given, that where even Putnam also says that this very
Okay, hang on. So there's a lot of philosophy just in that question. So the first thing is we want to get clear on what is the myth of the given.
Yeah, so I mean this very pure, unadulterated empirical content in terms of sense data, which has been taken by the empiricists as a building blocks for their large scale to make kinds of cognitive claims, where even Putnam says that even within empiricism, whenever they call it sense data, even that is also wrapped into a conceptual content. I mean, you do not have it available unless you use the word sense data or sense data. And yet he says it is good to have something to begin with rather than having nothing. So, but then I think he cites with what Sellers and Davidson says, that no content is available as pure, unadulterated. It is always through conceptual schemes that we get it.
Okay, so I think this is where Burge's book is very powerful, because it gives us a whole toolkit to talk about how there is a process of classification and recognition of incoming stimuli by the cognitive system that does not yet amount to conceptualization. And so, right, it's not like, so you're working on the other, that everything is either this pure thing or it's conceptualized. And that's part of this dichotomous kind of view of thinking about, what's happening in the whole perceptual stream is precisely what Burge tries to dismantle over, it's a very richly worked and detailed and richly worked out picture of how to think about something states in the middle that have a kind of proto-conceptual form, but they in fact take their content pretty much directly from the stimulus. And yeah, so I would reject the presupposition in your question that everything is either conceptual or it's some pure unadulterated thing. The question is empty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah. Good one.
The talk. And also, I think the question could be asked. So when you talk selection history, is it like when we perceive something is the history of what you say as the
So selection history can, let me just give you a really simple example of selection history. So suppose I have an experiment where every time I'm given a cue and then I'm given a target and I have to hit a button when I see the target, right? And if it turns out that there's a kind of statistical regularity, which I may not be consciously aware of, that the target is that the target is appearing in the upper right quadrant of the screen, right? Then over time, I will actually pick up on that and I will be faster in hitting the button to select the target because I have learned and I know that there's been this kind of influence on my selection that has speeded my responses.
Okay, and if it is a prompt response, so this selection history, like how does it is like unconscious or like
yeah, this is all unconscious. Yeah, this is all unconscious. This is all happening below the surface threshold. I mean, so there's a huge amount of statistical learning that we are able to do in a completely non-conscious way.
Yeah, so how is it different from, let's say, like the phenomenological account of the attention? Like, for example, if I'm perceiving the word as like Husserl says that, okay, there is always a retention and I anticipate something and accordingly I structure the word. So it is not a very conscious or intentional subject, but it's something what is called as the background structure. So how is it different to that account of the attention?
Well, I think that's a very valuable question to ask, because one of the things that I think, especially those of us coming from philosophy and having read philosophers on attention, is that there is a certain narrowing of the very concept of attention when it is in the hands of psychologists. And that narrowing of the concept of attention is the consequence of a methodological kind of work, which is that psychologists will focus on what they can measure. They will focus on what they can manipulate and measure, right? And then what happens is that, they really focus on that and call that attention. But I think that have a lot of attention is a very unusual psychological term, in that it is both a kind of everyday life, right? We talk about, hey, pay attention, right? Or we say, I really have to attend to this matter today, or something like that, right? But it also has a meaning in a scientific theory, right? And that's different from more technical terms in a scientific theory like working memory, right? We don't have an ordinary conception of working memory. We have just this ragbag notion of memory, but the technical notion of working memory is different. So I think that because the notion of attention has its home in our everyday psychological language, we should keep reminding psychologists of the aspects of attention that they don't particularly look at and don't particularly study, because they don't really have good tools to study it with, But that doesn't make it not attention. It just means like, oh, I don't have good tools to study it in a kind of psychometric way.
So I couldn't at this attention with will. What it actually? How does you connect this with the attention?
Okay, so the thought is, let me give you a very simple example of attention that has nothing to do with your will, right? So you're focusing on me right now when you're talking to me, right? But if something that was shaped like a snake or a spider happened to land on your table, it doesn't matter how intently you are focusing on listening to me or our exchange, your attention would be drawn by that, right? Because there are certain things, like particularly snakes and spiders, where evolutionary we have the perceptual system will immediately respond to that, right? Does that? And you can, it's quite easy to understand why. Where those of our ancestors who didn't respond, didn't reproduce.
So it is quite close to what Heidegger says, the breakdown of the ready to hand, and suddenly things become the present and had. Right? The famous example, time I'm absorbed in some activity like working on the laptop, suddenly it goes haywire, suddenly it becomes from the practical engagement, suddenly it becomes the theoretical engagement. My attention is now focused on the parts, unlike earlier, which it is like a more ready to hand.
Well, I would be very cautious in asserting any claims of the form X is similar to Y, right? Because everything is similar to something else in some respect, right? The issue is we want to we want to we want to focus on to use some terminology that Professor Dasgupta helpfully introduced, we want to focus on like joint carving similarities, right? If there are sort of interesting structural similarities. So I before we get to linking anything I said here today with Heidegger, we'd have to do a lot of work to build that interpretive
bridge. Yeah. Let him first. After that, Mr. Guru will speak. Let him speak first. He has not spoken yet. No, he was microphone. That's coming.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. There's a specific question about the three empirical objections. I was wondering why not still think of top and bottom approaches as paradigmatic instances, even if they happen to merge. So I was thinking something like system one, system two differences. So, I mean, that Kahneman and Tversky talked about. So you might say that there are a lot of processes that have a combination of system one, system two, but it still makes sense to have that talk of system one and system two separately, so that you have these paradigmatic instances. So maybe top and bottom would still have some relevance as paradigmatic instances.
Yeah, so ultimately I wouldn't want to go with something like that, because again, in the larger paper that this is a part of, getting rid of the top down distinction is getting rid of one particular way of structuring the mind, and I'm actually using that. I need that in my larger argument, because I want to argue for thinking of the mind as being structured on the principle of dependent origination, and then what I'm going to argue that allows us to speak in a much more natural way of many different areas of the brain being recruited for any one particular mechanism, but there's still an interesting underlying structure, and then how that connects up with the issue of the will and how we should think about the subject. But again, as you can tell, those are all very big claims, and this is just one very small step in, I think, something that requires, I am now realizing more and more, is actually like a lot of steps have to be argued for in great detail. So that's why I want to reject that claim.
Even then, you can speak a few more sentences along with the triviality.
No, I think this is a very complex to which I don't have access. I want to really create some access for myself to pitch in. And for that, creating access, I need to really shift your attention from the psychological to political, philosophical. Now, my plea is that we need to liberate this question of attention from the asymmetries that are between top and down. Or even bottom becoming top is also not acceptable, because there's a symmetry, there's a power asymmetry involved in this. That's one question. No, not one comment actually. The other one is to liberate attention from this dichotomy, this asymmetry. We can assign some lovable value to it. Egalitarianism, for example. Political philosopher would say, look here, attention is always asymmetrical, driven by power. I may not look at you. It is my, I may not see, sorry, you are just close to me, that's why I'm just looking at you. But so I will decide I will decide to whom I should seek my attention. Isn't it? I will in the conferences, I will seek attention of somebody. In Delhi, in IIC, you get this anyway. Yeah. But the question is there a possibility of actually making this more egalitarian? The very attention as a moral good. Is it possible to distribute attention equally?
So actually, an area of active research right now. I myself am not involved in it, but there's a very interesting and important work being done on what's called the norms of attention. So if you just Google norms of attention, there are lots of people who are thinking about what is the moral upshot of the ways that we give attention to people, to issues. Also, it has huge political consequences. What are the issues that we are giving attention to? Why are we giving our attention to those issues as opposed to some other issues? So if anybody's interested, and I'm happy to send you a list of resources on that. But yeah, I mean, you can just Google norms of attention or put it in Phil Papers, norms of attention, and you'll see a whole bunch of work that is just coming out now.
Can you make it not norms but principle? But you just can't really avoid giving attention or taking attention. I'm seeing this Ronald Dawkins work on this. This is the fundamental work on this. The debate between Rawls and Dawkins on this. And Rawls is missing this point, but Dawkins has captured. And so when we are actually, for feminist point of view, for example, this question of attention becomes so absolutely important. I mean, I said touching and not touching is also involved in this attention. Attention is the carrier of touching and not touching. Now you are looking at me, I'm touched. How are you looking at me? In what is your gestural language? Is constitutive of this attention with touch. I mean, this is. I mean, you can send me the list of. I can then read more on this and make more informed argument later on.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is also an issue that some writers or novelists have dealt with quite sensitively. The way in which people change. I mean, look, attention is very important to us, right? I mean, it's sort of it's a thing we want from our parents. It's a thing we want from our teachers. It's a thing that we want from our friends or whatever. And when we get it, right, it can lead to an amazing kind of flowering. If we don't get it, it can lead to us kind of withering away. So yeah, I mean, I don't deny any of that. And unfortunately, what often happens is that these issues are so complicated that you start off thinking about what is perception, and you look at all the papers on perception, and it's like, okay, here's this red tomato, and it's like, that's not what I was interested in. So but we got to start with issues that are more tractable before we go to the really deep and difficult issues.
In fact, just follows from your last sentences that you have said, very profuse sentences. In fact, in Nikaya Sutta, in Buddhist texts, we have something like wilting. When I get attention, I get really wilted, Buddha says. So when his followers were paying a lot of attention to him and his preachings, he said, I get wilted by that. I don't get really inspired by getting the attention. My inspiration follows from a sense of bodhi, which is non-attentional, non-figurative, and everything that goes with that so there is a certain kind of a disjunctivism that Buddha plays through between the cognitive mechanism and its outputs in the sense of being wilted. So do you see that it goes beyond this crisscross of top down and bottom up, and goes into another realm altogether the moment we think about who is a bodhisattva or who is exercising bodhi in the form of attention?
Well, I will I'm just talking about lockic phenomena. This is all alaukic, so 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 I so I'm not denying the reality of all that, but it's what in the text is called alaukic. So that particular kind of wilting, I don't think is a physical phenomenon this way.
Okay, I mean, this was fascinating. Give a big hand to Professor.
Thank you.
And look forward to his full paper, and probably this depends on Rahul to bring out this kind of fascinating papers. So we declare this session to an end, and we again reassemble for the next session. Thanks, Professor Dasgupta, once again.
I was amazed how much you got generated. That was really exciting. Yeah, no, it was really. I was just playing. Yeah. No, I think what's so nice about it is you were able to generate so much from such a slim base.
Now the next session is being started. Good noon to all of you. I'm Kalpana Yadav, assistant professor in this department. And so first of all, I request the dignitaries to please come on the dais. Professor Samik Das Gupta, sorry, he's here. Okay. Dr. Prashant Kumar and Dr. Manas Jyoti Deka. Please come on the dais. I request Dr. Rahul ji. I request Dr. Rahul to please felicitate our speakers, Dr. Prashant Kumar and Dr. Manas Jyoti Deka. Please come on the dais. Where is Prashant? There are two presentations in this session, and this session is being chaired by Samik Das Gupta, Professor Samik Das Gupta. Now, I'm going to present a brief bio note of both speakers, Dr. Prashant Kumar. So, Dr. Prashant Kumar is an assistant professor of philosophy at Lakshmi Bai College, University of Delhi. Formerly, he was the guest faculty at Zakir Hussain Delhi College, and he earned his PhD from the Center of Philosophy, JNU. His interest area is ontology, meta-ontology, and metalogic. Now, I would like to present a brief introduction of Manas Jyoti Deka, sir. So, he is an assistant professor from University of Allahabad, and he has completed his PhD from JNU. Now, I would like to call upon Dr. Prashant Kumar for his presentation. Oh, I request Dr. Rahul to please felicitate our speaker, Dr. Prashant Kumar. Apart from this, I request chair to please conduct the session. Okay, so please come. So, Dr. Prashant Kumar, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Chair, for having me here and listening. I'm going to present on the pragmatism and ontology of memes, cultural tools turning into digital beings. I mean, when we start talking about memes, I don't think right now there will be anyone who doesn't understand what memes is. I think every night, every morning, we are sharing reels, we are following certain contents, and we think then at least in some sense we know what meme is. And the important question that I really think about meme is why meme needs to be considered philosophically. What is something there in the meme that we need to take care of? And I think that there was a one incident that happened back in 2017 in Rajasthan when certain 200 people of a certain religion mob lynched a person. And then at the start, a debate started happening about politics of food, about certain concerns, what we need to eat, what religion we need to belong, and there were certain other questions. My concern was what exactly happened that helped 200 people together at one particular point and lynch a person who claims to be, let's say, that non-violent and peaceful gathering. And I think that if you start looking at what was exactly happening in 2016 and 15, you will figure it out. There were n numbers of memes circulated on certain things that led to believe so many people what they believe. So if that's the power of meme we have, I think that we really need to look forward to the ontological structure of memes. And that's how we can. That's what made me look why philosophically it is significant to understand what meme is. And most of the time we think that philosophy can be done in so many ways and memes cannot be one point of view. So you can see that this particular meme. This was made by a philosopher, Simon Evening. Simon Evening made this meme just to center out what Nietzsche is saying, that there are two ways you can do philosophy. And then Batman is slapping Robin and saying that, no, I've just left out the memes. And even when we start talking about memes, even philosophers were not left. See, Socrates became, and that's what exactly I really wanted to have and see. And you will be shocked to know that this is the highest shared emoticon in the last decade. And now think about it, what exactly happened. We started something from a serious to this particular point, a laughter. And that's the disguise memes are having right now. Most of the contents are circulated in the name of laughter. So you laugh and you consume a content. You laugh and you consume a content. So why? And let's figure it out. What I'm going to do, if that's the thing. The first thing I'm going to ask, what do we need to ask in order to provide a comprehensive and inclusive understanding of ontology of memes? So what kind of things we need to have in order to have a better understanding of ontology of memes? The second, what are the changes in theoretical understanding of memes since its first appearance in academic literature, and whether there are any changes in its ontological structure? And the third, what are the impacts of digital memes? And here I am moving from memes to digital memes on humans, if there are any. So as we proceed in our talk, we will figure it out that the first understanding of meme was not exactly what we believe right now. So let's understand what we really need to have. There are four philosophers: Aristotle, Quine, Heidegger, Marcus Gabriel. Definitely, I'm not going to talk about their ontological stance or even their metaphysical stance. But what is significant about them, the kind of questions they are asking or the ways they are asking the question. So if you understand Aristotle's understanding of metaphysics, and where he's saying that it's a science to understand being qua being in terms of being without falling in circularity or falling into the other domain which we can't explain. So if we start understanding the question is what, in terms of what. Similarly, if we move to Quine, though he starts the question what is being, but further as he proceeds, he moves to what is being relative to a particular theory. And that's how he's moving. And he says that in order to understand the notion of being in an analytical tradition, we need to have something through which we can explain. Similarly, the way Heidegger is going to ask the question, and it becomes clear how he answers, the question, what is being becomes how is being, how a particular being appears in the world, and then through you can explain it. For Marcus Gabriel, the question, where becomes quite significant. And my hypothesis is here, unless and until we do not understand memes from all these four perspectives, we might not have an inclusive and comprehensive understanding of meme. So if we have to understand the ontology of meme, we need to ask these four questions. So let's say that the another question, what are we really asking when we ask memes? And then again, there are two domains we may probably enter. The first is meta memes and the second is ontology of meme. And we are not getting into meta meme because the moment you get into meta memes, there will be certain implicit question, which I have already discussed while I was talking about the philosopher. So let's move into the ontology of meme, and then these kind of questions we can think about it. What is a meme, or what constitutes a meme? And why I'm talking about the constitution of meme, because it may have give us a particular structure, the ontological structure, how memes are constituted. The second, how does a meme appear? And why I say that how does a meme appear? Because the same picture that you have seen, you just put any other content, or sorry, you just put any other content and you will change the entire perspective. So how a meme appears is also a significant question, and it can also help us the circulation, the virality that you see in a digital world. The third question, where does a meme appear? And why it becomes significant when I will be dealing with the cultural understanding of meme and digital understanding of meme, the question of where is quite significant. So maybe if I just use one phrase, honesty is the best policy, I think that everyone follows. If I say that this is also a part of meme, it's a meme of, it's an example of a cultural meme. And how does it circulate amongst many minds and many brains of people? So the institutions for the family, the educational institution, the political institution, and there are so many, and they were working as aware of the answer to this particular question. And then the fourth question, why does a meme appear? Why we are having a particular meme over, let's say, that n numbers of meme? Why something becomes so viral, something so significant in a digital culture? So these are the four questions, and the moment we start asking the question, maybe we are having some broader and comprehensive sense of the ontology of memes. And this is a brief history of memes. And I'm not going to read the entire thing, but the one particular, the first three actually talks about the understanding of culture meme, and there is a slight deviation, and at the end you will find the understanding of digital meme. Richard Dawkins was the first one who introduced the term meme in his book, The Selfish Gene. You might see the rhyming between gene and meme. And so if you, the introduction of the word meme by Richard Dawkins was not on a, let's say that after a lot of ponderation, but it was actually, he was looking for a rhyming word. And he thought that gene rhymes with meme. And he also found etymological origin in Greek. And this is my meme. So gene, meme, my meme. So that's how it goes. So, and he says that culture units of information, so memes are culture units of information, and those information are short, memorable. So if you remember any meme that is happening in June 2024 in India, should I remind you? Tomato. And with that word, you understand what kind of meme I'm talking about it. So what is it? It's the smallest unit, but memorable, which was also happening in terms of genes. So if you start making relation between cultural units of memes and genes, the mutation was very small and it takes a longer time. But in digital meme, it doesn't happen. In one day, you can have n numbers of mutation. And that's the change that we are talking about in digital memes. And these are the differences that we can think about it. What are cultural memes and what are digital memes? So in cultural memes, they are subject to variation, they are subject to selection, but the virality is not in a less time. But when we talk about the digital memes, it actually is disguised under a joke, under a laughter, and the memorable, and the content is hidden. So if you remember, how does it happen? I mean, it is quite prevalent in politics. So if you remember 2000, I mean, if you remember Obama's election, most of the members of their election committee. They already know that who is going to vote for Obama and who is going to vote for the other people. And how is it happening? Because they are putting certain critical information under disguise of laughter, and they are propagating it again and again. And why and how digital memes are quite can be differentiated from cultural memes in terms of its speed, distribution, and virality. So in one day, any meme can become viral, and that can have a long-lasting influence on human brain, which can also somehow divert and mutate your consciousness, your understanding of your own self and also the world. So these are three hypotheses that we can come with. The first hypothesis is memes as slave to genes that build the brain, which copies them and profit them. That's a Daniel Dennett's understanding. And here, why I'm talking about this kind of understanding, this kind of hypothesis in the first way, I am trying to divert the entire discussion to the question of where right now. Why? Because here, brain becomes the answer to the question of where. The second hypothesis is memes serve as their own ends, and now here memes is becoming as autonomous, independent entity. Let's say that ontologically independent, where it's replicating whenever they can. So once you made a meme, you can just simply forget about it, and it's getting profited again and again, and you don't need any human intervention because of the space there. And they sculpt our mind and cultures as they wish to do. So now, earlier we were having certain control over cultural memes. Now memes are having certain control over us. The third, in digital world, it depends on the creativity of a human and their understanding of digital environment around. Still, you can see there's some autonomy and some interference of a particular human being, particular group of human being over memes. But as we see further, you will see that memes are having a larger influence and control over human beings. So what is exactly happening? This kind of structure actually tells us, because earlier we just have a three hypothesis of memes, but still we are not so sure about how it is interacting with human beings. So the first section where you will see that there's the information. So you can information, I mean, from the first picture of meme where Batman is hitting Robin, that's the information. So Batman is hitting Robin, it shows a kind of disappointment in the highest form, where Batman is forced to hit Robin. And now you can put anything that is like disgusting, that you disagree, that you are disappointed with, and you just put the otherwise. So there is a sense that something is there, and you take a break and you introduce your own perspective. All right, so that's the information. But your meme also needs to be aesthetically pleasing. Otherwise, why would I follow you? Why something becomes viral? And then what I'm calling the ontological ornamentation. You need to put something in some way that it demands. I mean, it attracts so many people. Unless it's not doing that, your entire point of virality is going down. So, and that also tells the reason why. So why we are having a meme, because we want to have our interest to be served, and then we are going to put ontological ornamentation. So an ontological ornamentation in such a sense that it opens for possibility. It needs to be ambiguous, because if it's not ambiguous, most of the people won't be able to interpret. And if most of the people won't be interpret, it will not get the sense of virality. So that's the particular section we need to have in order to understand the ontological structure of memes. And ontological efficacy comes if we start asking the question, where does a meme appear? Because think about it, if I just make a meme of Socrates and start circulating in the computer science department, how many of you think that it is going to be viral? No, not a single one will start understand that what is it about. So where is so significant? And there are three possible choices here: mind, papers, virtual world. So you can also think about right now, I mean, we are having election in Delhi, you can send so many papers out there, but it takes a lot of time to follow up to meme. But in a virtual world, even one click and with some kind of money you can spend on Facebook and Google and put the ad, and it can be like circulated like anything. So the moment you put it, it is also going to show the ontological efficacy. So that's the one part of ontological structure. The second, how it is interacting with human beings. And there you will find in a bracket structuration, how humans are interacting with memes, it creates a kind of structuration. It means that we are creating memes and memes are getting interacted with human beings. Then again, those human beings are going to mutate meme. Then again, they are going to create a structure. Then again, after mutation, structure. So we are going to create layers and layers of a society within this meme system. And see, yeah, I'll be. And then this is here Anthony Giddens' structuration theory. The first 3 points are quite significant. It's like the larger social structure, let's say that larger digital structure is both the medium. So like we are the medium, but at the same time, we are also the product of this entire process. We can think about the language. The more we talk about a particular language, it is going to be broad enough. The second, in this particular understanding of structuration, we almost think that we are free, but we are highly influenced, and we need to focus on highly influenced. I think that is just to make us feel better that we are free, and that's why he's putting it, and I'm going to argue quite against that. The third is rules and resources. So in a society, we think that rules and resources are somehow free. I mean, that's also how digital world was introduced to us. It's free, without rules. You have all those things. But right now, can we really say that our Facebook, Twitter, and all those are like free, and who owns all the resources? So that's how we need to think about this whole entire structuration theory. So if this is the kind of structure that we are going to have, and rules and resources are simply controlled by that, how many of us really think that we are going to be the free agent? So here, Daniel Dennett says that, I do not know about you, but I am not initially attracted by the idea of my brain as a sort of dung heap in which the larvae of other people's ideas renew themselves. Before sending out the copies of themselves in an informational diaspora, it seems at first to rob my mind of its importance as an author and a critique. And the real question comes, who is in charge? According to the vision, we or our me? So that's the kind of question it comes out. So I'm going to miss out this because I have less time. So let's think about it. Now again, the question, who is in charge? So Shana Jagov, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, if you have also watched The Social Dilemma on Netflix, a wonderful show. I mean, if you're really interested in this kind of thing, you can just simply watch it. It's no longer enough to automate information flows about it. Earlier, we were considered as disciplinary body. Our actions were guided and disciplined in some way. But we have passed that thing. We are moving into what we call, what Hahn calls, psychopolitics direction. Now the new goal is to automate us. So think about it. You want to become better in your own life. Now there is no one else who is watching you. You yourself watch for yourself. So that's the kind of automatic. That's the kind of automatic ask. So and think about it further. Imagine you have a hammer, and think about it. Imagine you have a hammer, and that's machine learning. It helped you climb a green mountain to reach the summit. That's machine learning's dominance on online data. On the mountain top, you find a wild pile of Niles, cheaper than anything previously imaginable. That's the new spark sensor tech. An unbroken vista of virgin gold stretches before you as far as you can see. That's the whole dumb world, us. Then you learn that anytime you plant a nail in a board with your machine learning hammer, you can extract value from the formerly dumb plank. Think about it, how Facebook, Instagram are extracting data from us and for free. That's data monetization. What do? You start hammering like crazy and you never stop unless somebody makes you stop. But there's nobody to stop. And this is why the internet of everything is inevitable. And that's how we are moving forward. Okay. So if that's the case, you are what you mean, because the possible scenarios, rules and resources are completely owned. The kind of interaction that we are going to have with the digital world is like almost. We also know that the recent study shows that the time that you have, the attention time that you have is 7 seconds. That's why your reel is for 8 seconds. And that's what you become. So I want to leave you with one particular question. Thank you.
so we have some time for questions. Do you want to stay up there?
Yeah, fine.
Do you want to circulating the, or shall I circulate it? There's a question, two questions over there. Start up.
Hi, thank you. I just have two small questions. First is Zizek in his famous joke on the Mongolian peasant, he said that the joke is a kind of act where you cannot do the actual act and you try to subvert. In the same manner, does meme try to subvert the actual action first? And the second thing is, uh, what what is that which determine the meaning in meme? Is it the content or is it the template? Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. First, to answer the first question, remember, I think that everyone has watched Friends now. Everyone at least have some episodes. What happens when you watch Friends? You find, so I'll just tell you what happens in a. You find a funny, you find a funny scene there, and if you want to laugh at that funny scene, there is someone else who is laughing from your part. The scene itself. So what they are trying to do, even they don't want you to laugh at the scene that they are creating for you to laugh. So yes, in one sense, the Jakob is trying to say that they are trying to push you to in an automate mode. All right. So I hope that this answers your first question. And the second question that you asked, what gives the meaning? I think the memes are more interesting to attract the crowd, and they are going to put the content is exactly what the meaning is. But the first thing is that how they are going to attract the crowd, which is the form, the picture that you are seeing that. So we all are familiar with Batman slapping Robin. If you read comics and if you watch all those things, that's the central point. It's like how I can first attract you into my trap, and then I'm going to feed religion. I don't want to say that, but yeah.
Yeah, sorry. If that is the case, if what you said template is the base which is determining, then the meaning of meme is universal. Like for instance, that famous meme or famous template of a man turning back towards the women, with though he's having a wife or girlfriend and still turning back. So I know the template.
I just deleted that meme. I thought it will be inappropriate.
Okay.
But yeah.
I know the template, but like for example, you are putting some different content there, which I'm not familiar with. As you give an example of Socrates and computer science, but still, just because of the template, I'm still making the sense of that.
Template is for attracting people.
But does universal here then?
No, because the meaning. I mean, if you say that it's a combination. I mean, if you are going to be boiling down to where it exactly meaning lies in a particular kind of meaning, obviously it's because the template gives a wider area of what we can call the field of sense, and the content actually is an example of that field of sense. So the content can only give meaning within that picture. All right. In that sense, I say that. So template is specifically to attract people. So we are going to find those content which is already popular. In that sense.
Got it. Thank you.
Hello, sir. Actually, about the memes, what I see is it is related to the identity, I guess. That it hurts a particular kind of identity also, or it defames. It can be taken as the criticism. Okay, that someone tried to uh, criticize someone or mock some particular kind of group, and some might be that they will not actually like this type of act. So basically, it's not a kind of act which is not acceptable to a particular group. And as you given the example that particular kind of people mobilize and lynch the human being. So
is it also a kind of unacceptance? So how to see?
So I'll say that there are many memes which are unacceptable if we look at what we call the social and ethical perspective of a particular society. So the kind of meme your neighbor was talking about, that was precisely that kind of meme. It was socially unacceptable. It's like one man is going with his wife slash girlfriend and he's looking at another woman. All right, you might have seen that meme as well, which is categorically unacceptable in a society. It might hurt so many people. And it's, if you ask that, in my last presentation, I added that thing because I really wanted to show that there are so many things which are not socially acceptable. They become popular in that particular society, like in a faster base. So if you want to make something viral, you say something which is not acceptable in a society. That makes it viral. So I think that yes, most of the memes which are not socially acceptable gets virality in no time.
We have 2 more questions and 4 minutes, so if I could ask you please to keep it on point. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Like when you were talking about agency, a quote from Arthur Schopenhauer came into my mind. Like I'm just paraphrasing. Like man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. So, so I just want to like say that what's your perspective on free will? Is it an oxymoron? Like will and free, can they go together, or what's your interpretation on this? Thank you.
All right, so the slide that I just skipped, that talks about that particular question. But yeah, okay, so I'll say that the kind of interaction that we are going to have with uh, new ways of virtual reality, let's say that if we are going to have metaverse, augmented reality, in a way that we are having right now Instagram. So think about it, if you somehow check your screen time, how much time do you generally spend in social media? 6 hours? Yeah. 8 hours, all right. So let's say that over and all 6 hours, though the current study says that if you follow the analytics of Facebook, they say that at least 6 to 7 hours normal Indian consume data. But now think about it. If we are going to pursue this further and we are going to have virtual world, metaverse, your colleges, your universities, which are going to be in metaverse and augmented reality. And if that's the case, your 6 hours will go to almost 14 and 15 hours. And now think about it, if we are going to have 14 to 50 hours with the attention span of 7 seconds, even if we want to have free will in principle, does it have any pragmatic sense in our daily life or not? So that's how I would like to answer this question of free will.
One last question.
Thank you, Dr. Prasad, for your really interesting presentation. I was just wondering, I mean, when you are talking about memes, right, whether since they make people laugh, so whether they make indiscriminately laugh to all human beings, or is there any some selection process also going on? Because if the memes are politically driven, right, there's political intention behind it, then we do become selective. We are not processing any kind of meme, or the meme which does not suit our own political choices, right? And then we do not laugh at it. Rather, we kind of we we just don't take it as a pleasant uh, uh, thing to watch our meme. I mean, to laugh at it. So, what do you?
I think in my humble submission, I say that it can never make other people laugh indiscriminately. If you are going to make a meme on me that I'm presenting a meme philosophically, which is not a meme, it's a meme. And I will definitely not laugh at it. So, हंसी का माहौल बना रहना चाहिए. Thank you so much.
Dr. Decker, so William, and you have 20 minutes to talk in the book.
Last speaker. I am so happy to be here because some 20 days back, I thought that I wouldn't be able to be here. I was suffering from dengue severely. I was in hospital. But my sincere thanks goes to Rahul, of course, and the organizers. I do have some phenomenological experience of living as a Buddhist, as a shaman, and Buddhism is to actually very close to my heart in a way. So, though I am born as a Hindu, and I was always trying to find or trying to meditate on the question of self, Buddhist self, and my research is on philosophy of psychoanalysis. So I tried to combine this self and psychoanalysis. So there is certain common points I find in Nagarjuna's text, what I try to brought out, and then try to highlight or give some interpretation through psychoanalysis, how, and try to see whether they complement each other, and then try to arrive at certain points, what can, to some extent, be helpful to sort out some psychoanalytical or psychological problems. So here it goes. I will read out some of it. In Mula Madhyamika Karika, Nagarjuna expresses the view that the self is neither of the aggregates nor apart from the aggregates. Thus, it is neither a permanent substantial form which is already there to dictate terms, nor something that is completely subject to annihilation. It is in between these two extremes. Hence, the self is such a construction which at the same time is there and not there. It has to be there as it definitely does some useful works, and at the same time not there as it is but an illusion that has to be finally overcome. For Nagarjuna, this in-betweenness is also to be understood in terms of the Atma-iti and Mono-iti, the I-ness and the mind-ness, the subjective as well as of the objective within the subjective framework. Hence, the objective is an essential part of the very subjective, for the subjective cannot be there without the objective part of the very subjective. They are interdependent, and their dependency explains their origins. Hence the saying, I quote, someone is made known by something, something is made known by someone, unquote, is also to be realized in this context, which suggests someone as the subjective part of the self, while something is the objective part. The question is, how do we understand this dichotomy between the subjective and the objective of the self? For that, we may turn to Nagarjuna's other texts, including Ratnavali first, and then some psychoanalytic delineation of the same topic second. I argue it to be the same topic, as it is here where we find in Nagarjuna's philosophy a description of the self in terms of a mirror, which strikingly resembles psychoanalytic description of a self offered by Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan. Nagarjuna's Ratnavali delineates that human self is seen as constructed on a mirror where aggregates of basic elements are organized as a form. I quote Ratnavali, it is just as when a person using a polished mirror is able to observe the reflection of his own face in it. This reflection is only something one is able to perceive, for it has never been something real, unquote. This ability to observe depends on a mirror because, I quote, were a person to refrain from holding up the mirror, he would no longer observe the reflection of his own face. So too, when one analytically contemplates the aggregates, then the view imputing a self straight away ceases to exist, unquote. However, the self is essential to construction of a reality as, I quote, it is based on the presence of a view imputing existence of a self that karmic action or becoming of life continue constantly on, unquote. In fact, this metaphor of a mirror gets a literal example in the psychoanalytic explanation given by Freud.
This example paves a way to a useful theorization later in whole psychoanalytic experiments of treating neurotic or psychotic patients. In the interpretation of dreams, Sigmund Freud has depicted a story of a baby who stands up to a mirror and plays a hide-and-seek game. While the baby stands up to the mirror, it utters a word or signifier da in German, meaning there, with excitement or joy, as if it gets back or discovers something which is earlier hidden or gone away. And then the baby sits down and thus hides itself from the mirror image of itself being sad, which Freud thinks to be translated by the word fort in German, meaning gone or away. The baby repeats it again and again. And according to Freud, with this meaningless game overcomes a tragic confrontation of a mother's going away from it. Freud, in another occasion, finds the same baby playing with a woolen ball, throwing away and bringing it back in repetition. For Freud, this game does not only helps the baby write the reality for itself, but also helps him or her consolidate an image of the self. This lonely game brings in the memory of a losing someone, in this context, mother, and gaining over her once more, and hence makes the baby get caught into a narcissistic self-image. However, as Jonathan Lear and Marcia Cavel argue, human selfhood in Freudian context is constructed while the baby confronts the process of internalization and externalization. The baby at first internalizes everything, including its mother's breast, to be inside, which is a kind of proto or prior selfhood, according to Lear. But as it encounters the painful fact that the mother's breast cannot be available all the time, and it also has to go through the pleasurable as well as painful physical activities like vomiting, urinating, defecating, or sweating, it develops a sense of outside of it, which gives the birth of objective reality eventually. Getting in or gaining over or standing up to a mirror is thus an internalizing activity that accompanies with letting go or losing or sitting down under a mirror, which is an externalizing phenomenon. The subjective and the objective is constructed this way in Freud. And we can see why an attachment to an image of reflection develops, as it helps in overcoming traumatic, painful experiences, constructing a necessary game of reality, which is at base starts with imagination. Here I want to refer to Nagarjuna's Yukti Sastika that emphasizes it. I quote, since the Buddhas have declared that world as conditioned by ignorance, how is it not reasonable that the world is an imagination or vikalpa, unquote. And thus this repetition of the game translates everything into a loop of coming back and going away for the self. In this very game, this very gambling that gambles with a subject superimposing ignorance, materializing or validating imagination or vikalpa. For Freud, it's a necessity for the subject, while for Nagarjuna, due to this necessity of gaming or gambling, I quote, the subject is attached to the reflection of the self because it takes the self to be true. And the subject is also trapped in the structure of the objects due to desire, unquote. While the coming into being as a mirror image and being away from it, in fact, initiates a present absent form of the subject. The subject indirectly, through misrecognition, is present via an illusory image and then absent at the same time, coming to its own. Nagarjuna's Sunyata Saptati, for me, many a times expresses only this. Nagarjuna says, I quote, without existent being or bhava, there is no non-existent non-being, abhava. Existent neither arises from itself, sata, nor from something else, parata. This being so, this does not exist. So there is no existent and therefore no non-existent, unquote. However, coming to Lacan, for Lacan, the example Freud has brought in should be taken not literally, but symbolically. The mirror is not a literal mirror all the time. It can be anything that has the capacity of mirroring back. Thus, from a mother's facial expression to peer group's gaze, everything can work as a mirror. This explanation is closer to Nagarjuna's explanation of the self. For Lacan, the image on the mirror constructs a self. However, this self is not the subject. It is just the ego. The subject needs it, for the self or the ego gives the subject a unitary image against the chaotic bodily stimuli which are separated from each other. Buddhist conscious khandhas get aggregated this way only, and it establishes the comparison of senses with the chaotic stimuli of the body, I argue. So the unity brings in coherency, and this coherency establishes a stable form which otherwise isn't possible for the subject. Therefore, the subject gets attached to this image of self. However, the subject isn't the self, as the self is but an image. It is basically an other to the subject. It is an illusion, although it is a necessary illusion. Thus, Lacan also argues that the relationship between the subject and the self or ego would be of aggression against an affection of each other. It is important to note that Lacan preserves the I-ness for the subject, which gets validated by the self or the ego. The self always tries to snatch away the ontology of this I-ness, trying to represent itself as the proprietor of the symbolic I-ness. Hereby, Lacan distinguishes the subjective and the objective of the subjective, which he calls in French by the signifier "toi and moi," I and me. I want to submit that this explanation begs a similar explanation of Mula Madhyamaka Karika. I want to interpret David Kalupahana's explanation of the text regarding the self this way only. I quote, "The cogito may thus turn out to be harmless, so long as it is considered to be a product of the sensory process. But argusum is what is dangerous, epistemologically as well as ethically," unquote. The cogito here stands for the subjectivity, while the argusum is theorized as the objective of the subjective. Of course, the objective part always tries to objectify the subjective. And in order to do that, it concocts a network of seduction. This seduction is in fact unavoidable. Lacan says, as it offers soussance to the subject, which is a real pleasurable pain or suffering. In Buddhist ontology also, the reality or world is indeed a suffering. Self is indeed the seat of illusion and hence mirage, depending upon which or following what only suffering may arise. Yet it is the very reality of the world, even though an imagination that offers pleasure. This pleasure or pleasurable pain or uncanny attachment ontologizes the illusion of imaginary sensibilities, albeit through the category of Buddhist avidya. In this game, the subject becomes a slave, and the substantialized self or ego becomes the master. And realization or break of avidya may not be sufficient enough towards freedom. As Mladen Dolor expresses a genuine concern in Lacanian way, which may be contextual in this regard. I quote, "It is the slave's enjoyment that comes surprisingly easily, and which presents an obstacle to the slave's liberation. Indeed, enjoyment appears as the one thing that one can never be rid of. It is recalcitrant to negation, and its negation produces a surplus," unquote. Isn't just, yeah, I will finish it within 2 minutes. Yeah. Isn't it the surplus of enjoyment then, through suffering, that binds as well as blinds the subject who meditates on emptiness or sunyata? In fact, Freud or Lacan's theory of language or speech speaks volume of it. Ordinarily, it may very easily be felt that language has nothing to do with Buddhist explanations of the self and salvation. However, when psychoanalysis establishes the fact that words or rather signifiers have material effects, that is, visible effects on body or mind of a person, then the Buddhist insight immediately enters the scene. Vyagraha Vivartani, this Buddhist text of Nagarjuna, clearly says that, I quote, names are but voids, unquote. Regarding the question where from the self originates or what is the usefulness of the self, Vyagraha Vivartani clearly establishes that, I quote, all things are devoid of intrinsic nature and hence void, unquote. And therefore, for Buddhist scholars like Epstein, it is sunyata or emptiness wherefrom every being originates. That means to be beings depend on other beings. Emptiness is like a wave or net that makes it possible. Epstein emphasizes that the root of the word sunyata means womb, mother's womb, you can think of. Reminiscent of mother's womb for a child wherefrom the baby is traumatically cut off, in psychoanalytic term to explain it. All things or beings is generated out of the womb, and therefore emptiness or sunyata should be understood as neither a mere nothingness nor a void, but the source of creation. However, following Nagarjuna's logic, we must hold it to be beyond any rationalization or conceptualization. Freudian, actually, I don't have the time to develop it, but I would like to finish with this. Freudian concept of uncanny, a concept that tries to capture the inside as well as the outside together, and Lacanian category of irreal, a category that works as a womb for every creation or categories, would definitely support this conceptualization of a Buddhist subjectivity that is lured by the possibility of symbolic imaginary reality of life that objectifies and hence substantializes a self. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, for some type of questions. You have a question? Just raise your hand. Yes. Maybe the microphone. Sorry.
Oh, where is the, yes.
Sir, you mentioned about somewhere you mentioned that the subject becomes
okay.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
So thank you, sir. Just one question I have, just a reflection. You mentioned that somewhere you mentioned that the subject becomes the slave and the ego becomes the master. So here I just want to clarify that in what context do you mean the subject to be and the ego to be? Is it that the subject is consciousness and the ego is somewhat a separate self, which is inside our heads? Or do you mean by subject something else and by ego something else? So that is the question.
Hello. Okay. Strategically, I avoided the word consciousness because that brings me to a schema of consciousness, pre-consciousness, unconsciousness. And I didn't want to go there. That is a Freudian framework. Subject is, of course, not the ego or the self in Lacan. And I found out that strikingly these Buddhist texts, all of these texts are saying that. It's exactly saying this. But these explanations is not there. but we can bring in psychoanalytic explanations to complement this. That was my point. And didn't have the time how it self gets originated actually. In Lacan, for Lacan, human babies are born in a helpless situation because they are born premature way, unlike other animal beings. So for him, all of a sudden there is a usurp of consciousness, a kind of consciousness, you may say that it's a kind of proto-consciousness that gives a sense of selfhood to the subject. But this selfhood is not the subject. Subject is something else, because this selfhood requires a mirror to be constructed, and that mirrors back. It is an other. You need an other to have a sense of self. So there is always a tussle between this ego and the subject. There is always an attacked and loving and hating kind of thing, and you can very easily relate the Buddhist affection, Buddhist attachment to this kind of thing, and it is there. It is there in the texts. I do not know whether I clarified. Is it okay? He wants to ask more. Yeah.
So you clarified the question, and you very beautifully explained another concept brought up. Like you explained that the self only comes in existence when the other is there. Like it reminded me of Jean-Paul Sartre. Like he mentioned about the concept of an other, like how it originates, and yeah. So that was it. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. In Jean-Paul Sartre, it comes through gaze, what he borrows from Hegel actually.
Oh, thank you very much for bringing in such a difficult topic, I think. Comparing Buddhist concept of self with triad as well as Lacan, which is not clear to me even. But the thing is, if we accept such type of selfhood, how can we develop an ethics or politics out of that? Because the difficulty with Nagarjuna's understanding of self is that shunyata, whether it is defined in any ways, how can it lead to some sort of ethical practices? I am not sure whether all the Buddhists, Professor Gokhale clarified, go by this type of understanding of selfhood in Buddhism also. But the thing is, how can we develop this sort of, whether in Pride, whether in Laka or in Nagarjuna, to a profound sense of ethics and politics? Because here I am very much disturbed, because the theme of this seminar is coping with the world. And I am finding these papers are not coping with the world. They are coping with oneself only. Again, back to metaphysics, which has not been in coping with the world, in my opinion.
Can you just, sir, can you just also say what do you mean by the ethical and political a bit? Because I didn't mention anything ethical and political, so that I can relate.
He mentioned about Satan. Other is there, but other is hell. In the earlier Satan. I'm not talking about the later Satan. Satan is struggling throughout his life because of his ethics. It is never come. So the thing is that the idea of the self, if you take a very this type of the selfhood, in which if it is formed because of the gauge, look, or something like conflictual idea of the self, how can you lead to a sort of Maitri, all this? find out
I got your point
the
now.
logical relation. What is there in your
There was one part of the paper I didn't bring in into my discussion is the play of language. In Lacanian paradigm, this is the play of the symbolic order. So where language plays a major part, and there the reality of the world is constructed. The world is possible only through language. And I wanted to bring in that Buddhist dependent origination, which actually all the time oscillates from one point to another point, always in a momentariness, can be related to that in a very much, because a signifier, the word, actually I should not say word, signifier is always dependent on other signifiers to exist. And that's why this presence and absence game is being played. And this is not only one interpretation of the self. I just found certain common point that I wanted to highlight. That self, in this way, if this is the way to look at self, then Lacanian interpretation or Freudian interpretation can complement the Buddhist understanding of self. Why is it important that in psychoanalysis we always read this kind of literature that how to patients, how to overcome or treat a patient who would be having neurotic or psychotic problems. In many cases, some patients suffer because they have inflated ego. It is there in even Buddhist texts that you have to first, in Vipassana, for example, I have certain literature, they say that you have to first let the ego be bigger so that you would be confronting it and knowing that it has to be overcome. You have to go beyond it. So there is this oscillation between here, there, and also here and there, not here and not there kind of thing, but you just cannot take a position. But the subjectivity has to be there somewhere. And the ego is an illusion, and it is clearly mentioned. So I just wanted to highlight and try to complement whether the Buddhist understanding of ontological thing, this kind of ontological sunyata, or this realization of sunyata, be applicable in treating certain patients. That was my ambition actually, and that is the ethical concern. And it can be political also if you apply this kind of realization into society or understanding social norms or other stuffs. I do not know whether I am clear enough. Thank you.
Hello. Okay, so now we have come to day one close, and we'll reassemble tomorrow at 9:30 here to engage and deliberate over the other presentation. So let's move now. Thank you. Yeah.